I'm going to talk about my novel today. It's called Lascar. I don't know if anyone has heard of the word Lascar.
I have.
You haven't? Nice to see you. Yeah, I know you have. Great news, lots of time. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, we've only got 15 minutes and it's very short. I'm just going to give you a brief history about the subject of Lascars, and then my son Ibrahim, he's going to read an excerpt at the end. And I'll also be sending signed copies if anyone's interested in buying a copy of my book. So, has anyone actually seen my book before? Come across it? Yes, I know you've read it. So what I'll do is, it's my first historical novel. I'm born and raised in Cambridge, and my mother once said that we had ancestors who probably worked on British steamships. So that's when I decided I wanted to find out more about it. You know, who were these men and how we didn't hear about them before. And that's what inspired me to write Lascar. So Lascar is the name given by Europeans to describe non-European sailors at the time of the East India Company. So it actually comes from the word Lascar. It's a Persian word for military camp or army, and it also comes from the Arabic word al-askar, which is a guard or soldier, and also the Portuguese word, which means Asian militiaman. So you can see that they're all sort of linked quite closely together. So you know, a lot of people think that Asian men, they all started to flood Britain in the 1960s and 70s, but in fact there was a small South Asian population dating back to the 16th and 17th century. So, but many of them actually came as professionals, like lawyers and politicians and doctors. And they came from the Indian subcontinent and other countries east of the Cape of Good Hope. And that was the initial East Indies. But the majority of them, they came from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But after 1860, it referred to men that came from South Asia, which is East India. East India today is present-day Bangladesh. What happened was that these men were recruited to work on British steamships, basically. These men, they were led to believe that they'd have a good life, they'd visit rich foreign lands, and you know, they'd earn good money to work on these ships. So what happened was the East India Company, they established trade routes and to discover, bring back new goods, you know, cargo such as tea, coffee, spices, sugar, and porcelain to Britain. So initially the Englishmen, they worked on these ships, they travelled to India. It used to take 3 to 4 months to travel to India. But by the time they got there, most of them deserted ship because they fell ill. It was a horrific journey. Can you imagine 3 to 4 months on a ship? And that's where these Lascars were employed on these ships to return to England. So they weren't forced to work, you know, they were employed as seamen to bring back cargo to England. But a lot of them, they were badly treated, they were cruelly treated, and many of them, when they arrived in England, they deserted ship. And basically, small settlements of Lascars grew, particularly in Shadwell, Wapping, in London, and in other port cities as well. And well, they chose a better life to work on shipyards and railroads rather than return home, you know, for another 3 or 4 months on a ship. You know, many of them did die of diseases. They weren't fed properly. You know, they were malnourished. And when they did arrive in England, their employers actually abandoned them, so they weren't paid. So, you know, they didn't have a choice. You know, they had to settle in England. And they were left to fend for themselves. So I can't go into too much detail about Lascars, as I said, but we haven't got a lot of time. So, you know, for over 350 years, they played a very important role to ensure that British goods were safely brought back in this country in times of peace and war. But by the eve of the First World War, there were about 50,000 Lascars in Britain. And these men had no choice but to contribute to the war effort. And basically they weren't fighting for their own country, and they were fighting for a nation that didn't really embrace them. And again, they had no choice. And I think these voices aren't really heard. It's only quite recently, last year, when you had the centenary anniversary of the First World War, that these stories were starting to slowly come out. You know, that's how the community grew. So, you know, I'm sorry I can't go into too much detail today, but feel free to ask me any questions at the end. And I'm going to get my son Ibrahim to read an excerpt of my novel. It's set in the 1860s, and it basically is one man's journey to England and how he travelled on board a steamship and he settled in Victorian London, and the desperate life that he lived in England. You know, it's got everything you want in it, a lot of action and a lot of prejudice. But I hope that you'll buy a copy and read the book at the end. So I'll pass it over to Ibrahim.
Ian climbed onto the shore, soaked and hungry, with barely enough energy to crawl. The men turned to the harbour and watched the Bengal. It now looked as if the entire ship was on fire. Ian watched as the orange flames lit up the black sky. He could feel ice in the air in the cold November night. Several boats floated around the ship. A few of the boats pulled bags of grain. Ian didn't care whether they stole the grain or helped the Bengal. He was free. Screams and shouts still carried across the water, punctuated with the crack of rifles. In the distance, horses screamed and thundered through the woods. A few Lascars cried out loudly as the beasts ran them down and recaptured them. Ian realised that others took advantage of the chaos and tried to escape. Together, Ian and Akbar crawled through the woods and collapsed in a clearing, shivering in the bitter cold night air. Another Lascar skulked through the undergrowth, snapping twigs and breaking branches. Farouk crawled on the ground next to Ian and collapsed in a heap. The men remained tense. Twigs cracked. Ian crouched, ready to pounce. The small man walked through the woods clumsily. His breathing heaved with each step. Farouk slipped behind a tree. "It is not a white man," Ian whispered. He did not see the person who stumbled through the trees, but his ears alerted him. Light footfall meant a small man approached as a boy. The uneven breathing came from pain, not overexertion. The person weaved his way through the woods in uneven and unbroken steps. Back from the direction of the harbour, white men carrying weapons could be seen slipping on shore. Ian tensed. "No." The word slipped out before he remembered to avoid alerting the whites who hunted the escaped Lascars. "Over here," Farouk called softly. "This way, boy." The boy stumbled into view. A hand hung limp at his side. Noor stumbled to Akbar and crumpled onto the ground. He lay still for several moments before Farouk reached over and shook him. "He is hot as fire." Farouk brushed the boy's cheek. "Where is Abid? You should be here by now." A lump choked Ian. He opened his mouth several times. The words did not come out without igniting the images of blood pumping as the body thrashed in the water. Nothing erased those few moments. Ian wondered if anything would ever wash away the horror of watching a body explode in the black water. Time passed. Farouk paced. "I will go find him." "No." Ian reached out and caught Farouk by the hand. A frown darkened Farouk's eyes. "I must find my cousin." Ian opened his mouth and shut it. "Ian, what do you know?" Ian's eyes burned. The truth choked him. The memory blinded him. "Ian?" Ian shook his head sadly. His mouth opened, but no words escaped. "Is Abid hurt?" Ian shook his head and coughed out a single word. "Dead." Farouk stood abruptly. "No." He clasped his head. Farouk shook his head repeatedly. "No, it cannot be," he wailed. "It must not be." His body started to rock as he babbled. "I vowed to his father, I vowed that I would protect him on my life." Farouk's eyes bulged. Fists started to flail at an invisible enemy. "I vowed I would not return home without Abid at my side. I vowed. I saw it." Ian grabbed his hand restraining. Farouk tore his hand away and stalked into the darkness. I vowed. The words echoed from the darkness. What happened to Abid? Noor whispered. You must be quiet, they are still hunting us. Noor wheezed. The sound turned Iron's blood cold, a vaguely familiar tenor to the sound, an unmistakable rasp. Eventually, exhaustion overrode adrenaline and the men dozed off. Iron dozed only lightly, Noor's wheezing disturbing his sleep and making him think of Kazi. The morning chill woke him, the sun hung low. Iron shivered. The morning was peaceful. No more sounds of the ship's engine. You could see London in the distance. Smoke billowed from the stacks and darkened the sky directly above. Noor does not move, Farooq whispered. Have his nerves ceased to function properly? Akbar asked. My mother's sister suffered from nerves that did not function properly. Most likely the infection from the white men's lashings took too much strength from him. Let him sleep, Akbar whispered. He needs time to heal, Ayan sighed. Ayan? What? Ayan, Akbar asked curiously. Are you angry? Ayan sighed. What do we do? I do not know, Ayan sneered. You are the one who makes plans. We are off the Bengal, Ayan whined. The plan worked. It did not work, Farooq growled. Not for all of us. We will grow colder here. The cold water numbed Ayan's feet so long ago. He was not sure he possessed the ability to walk.